And I want to do a preface because you might think, well, if you think Kubrick is such a good filmmaker, why are we spending time on this junk? Well, I would advise people who are not Kubrick experts to be cautious because although it might seem obvious that obviously given his films, he's a very artistic director, he wasn't necessarily negative towards blockbuster cinema. He actually was fairly open-minded that a lot of it was actually pretty good. And at its core was trying to do what he was doing, which is trying to, again, reflect upon ourselves as human beings. Now, obviously, his films are way more profound and way more strong. He is Kubrick. But I think when we look at something like Dredd and Blade, we see a kind of interesting continuum of the superhero mythology. Now, I'm not going to argue that Dredd is a great film, but I do think it's been overly criticized being just utterly stupid and barren of any artistic merit. It's just complete garbage. Blade, on the other hand, I think has been forgotten, but many people who remember it do recall it as a very strong film unto itself. Even if you're not into superheroes, you're not into superhero mythologies or whatever, it's a very well done film. It's very sleek, stylistic. It makes some interesting choices in terms of how the characters and plots move and things like that. And as a student of apocalyptic fiction and apocalyptic discourse, I thought it was really fascinating how that's what the film is about. It's a vampire apocalyptic film. It's a very religious film. It's a very mythological film. And I do think onto itself, Blade is much, much stronger. The characters are way more cohesive. The themes make a lot more sense. They resonate stronger over time. Whereas Dredd is much more sort of its time period, right? This is the era of Batman Forever, as well as Batman and Robin, and these other various attempts at doing the superhero myth, Batman, Batman Returns. And that's clearly a big influence on Dredd because if you know the mythology of Judge Dredd, it's not at all faithful to the comic. I've only read a few Dredd comics. I don't dislike them. I realize this is a British mythology. So I was able to get to a few of the comics as an American, but I'm not all that into it as much as an expert should be. But I do study comic book history, and so it's not faithful to the comic in any real sense. They just go very far from the source. Nevertheless, I do think people have exaggerated that it's just purely silly stuff, and Stallone is just destroying stuff all over the place and he's not doing anything. I think it's a little midway. I do think if you go back to it, I found a lot of darkness, much more than silliness. It's still overall very silly, but there are a few very genuinely dark moments. And I think the dystopia that they're showing is fairly well done because, again, they spent a lot of good money on the sets and the costumes. It looks great. I mean, it looks fantastic. So just purely from a visual angle, there's a lot there to feast on with the costumes, with the set designs, and just the way they built up Mega City and even some of the other things they do with special effects. I think overall that was really strong. Yes, the story is very lacking and the characters are a little bit all over the place, but I do think Stallone was doing more than a vanity project. I think, again, they were trying to do something midway of basically creating a Batman thing for him, but it was mostly focused on him. And I like Sly Stallone as a performer, but I just thought they could have just made this thing a lot stronger by moderating themselves. But I think he was very dedicated to the role, and the version of Dredd he's doing is actually very well done. It's not canonical, but it's not as stupid and silly as people made it out to be. So I'd give Dredd another chance and just look it up. Blade, of course, I think deserves much more consistent praise, though. I think in there we're going the opposite danger. We're going a little bit too far and saying it's flawless. It's 100% great. Now, there are a few things that are wrong with the plot in terms of the pacing and in terms of, well, how does his powers work? What are the limitations? The twists when they happen are pretty lame. But I think in terms of its core, yes, it's very strong. We have a very interesting anti-hero who's very pitiless. He doesn't have much humanity. I think Snipes did a very good job of just getting into Blade. It's not identical. It's not completely faithful, but it's much more faithful than Dredd. It's also much more consistent in terms of its style and tone. Although again, they throw in a couple of lousy jokes here and there. And I appreciated that it's not a feminist film, but it does have a pretty strong female protagonist. But they don't dwell on that. And the mentor and apprentice relationship, I think, is very well done. It's very implicit between him and Whistler. So there's a lot of things there that they were much more subtle than I think are given credit for. So I give it a lot of credit in being much more subtle than people think in terms of the characters. And I think, of course, the center stage is Stephen Dorff as Deacon Frost, which is still one of the most memorable comic book villains used in the silver screen. I think he's just like top 10 easily. which may say more about the villains that they usually show in these kind of films, like Thanos, are really stupid and don't make any sense, or just a pile of special effects, and they don't have any real emotive core. But I think Deacon Frost was really well done. He's a little bit one note, being obsessed with blood, but there we are. This can't be perfect. So overall, yes, Blade is a much stronger film on many levels, but I don't see these as radically different either in tone or quality. I think, again, it's a continuum. If Judge Dredd is kind of like a mediocre but a solid mediocre film, Blade is a much more refined and a much more committed film to its dark themes. But even there, it does have quite a few flaws, and I think it's inconsistent in many places. But overall, it's a very impressive work that they were able to go to a very dark place, but not go too far one way or the other, but just give a very strong anti hero mythology and do justice to the character and to the comic while doing its own thing as an adaptation. So I can't give like score grades because it's really, really hard in this case. I'd have to really think through what would be the scoring, but I would recommend highly both, especially Dredd, because I think it's been needlessly kicked around for no reason at all. If you really are patient with the film and actually examine it carefully, it's actually a lot stronger than people think. Or that's my opinion anyway. All right, this has been Pop Cult Analyzed on revising the superhero mythology.